Welcome to Manufacturing Tech Australia with Shane Williams and Paul Mason, where they share the latest manufacturing and tech news and explore innovative solutions to help you improve your business.
Shane and I have been talking a lot about how all the different modern technologies are really transforming the way that businesses operate and enable them to really gather all that data in the business and make more informed decisions out of it. So we decided on the show today we'd get James Deck from Clevvi, who's been in this business for over 20 years. And Clevvi really focuses on helping businesses transform by leveraging all these different technologies across different sectors like agriculture, manufacturing and transport. So we thought we'd get him on the show today. So let's get him on board. James, welcome to Manufacturing Tech Australia, and thanks for coming on the show, mate.
Thanks for having me. Really excited to be here.
James, you've been with Clevvi over 20 years. The business has been working on digital transformation, helping businesses all across the country in agriculture, manufacturing and transport sectors. So we wanted to get you on the show today, mate, to have a discussion around manufacturers are under pressure constantly to be more efficient, make smarter decisions using their data. Many are really still struggling. They've got all this data in the business. They maybe don't know how to capture it, don't know how to use it, and don't know how to make those smarter decisions from all that data that they have already in the business. So we wanted to get you on to just find out from your perspective, 20 years in this game, what's really holding these guys back from turning that factory data into successful business outcomes?
Really good question, Paul. For starters, you really touched on probably three key themes there, which at the end of the day, you've got to do three things right. You've got to collect the data, you've got to bring the data together and ensure it's an accurate representation of the organization, and you've got to know what questions you're trying to answer. And I think, unequivocally see firms that aren't making data-driven decisions failing in one of those three areas. So you've summed it up really nicely. When we talk about capturing the data, I think having data dark spots is more of a challenge potentially for industrial and manufacturing and logistics firms than maybe law firms or firms that are inherently completely digital. At the end of the day, a law firm or an accountancy firm, they're entirely digital. Everything's sitting in SharePoint or their legal practice system or whatever it may be. Whereas our clients and your clients, the manufacturers of the world and the industrial people, need to get that data out of machines. All the important stuff is either in a machine or in a person's activities. We all know that one of the toughest pieces of information you get is how long is it taking people to do a certain task, or how consistently are they doing that task. So these are things that are really tough to capture and probably to a certain extent weren't even possible for a smaller organization to capture historically. So when we look at things like ignition SCADA or we look at machine vision, some of these technologies that historically were only the domain of large organizations, particularly machine vision, it's really gone from $250,000 for a basic quality setup to a tenth or even less than that now. So I think what's really exciting, particularly in small and medium manufacturers in Australia, is the accessibility of some of this technology that's only been available to large organizations historically and the insights that can bring. But I think coming back to point number one is get the data. Got to collect the data. If you're missing the data, you can't answer the questions. Number two is making sure the data matches up. We had one mid-size organization we were helping where the managing director was getting frustrated that three different teams were giving him three different values as to what throughput was. And he said, how can my finance team and my production team be not agreeing on what the throughput of the facility is? That's just a fundamental objective number. It's not something that I should be getting two different numbers on. And yet they can work backwards. He says, take me through the data. They take him through the data and it's can't be disputed. We go and we talk to them and you go, the accountants are considering those units that were made after midnight as part of the previous day's batch because they're effectively not looking at a transaction level view. They're looking at, from their systems, it's this batch, and the batch is allocated before midnight, had this many units, and that's how many was created. Whereas production, of course, is counting literally the timestamp of each individual unit being made. So it just goes to show that sometimes when we're brought the challenge of, we actually are asking the same question of different people and getting different answers. The answers aren't wrong. That's the nuance of the data in a manufacturing context or an industrial context that's challenging. So you got to make sure that there's alignment between the data across all those systems, whether they be IT systems, OT systems, finance systems, production systems, MES, ERP, MES, all these things. And then finally, you've actually got to know what you're trying to solve for. All too often we see firms having an initiative to collect data and bring data into a data warehouse, it's not actually understood what problems they're trying to solve for. So normally I would say in technology, never lead with the solution, never lead with technology, lead with the business problem. My personal approach, and I'll be interested to hear your guys' thoughts, is data analytics is often a case where you just need to capture the fundamental data. So I accept that. In saying that, once you've got that baseline data in, you need to really understand deploying that data. And in terms of turning it into data-driven decision making and insights and useful information, again, I think all too often we look at the data sets and try and extrapolate or derive meaning from looking at the raw underlying information. The right thing to do is once you've collected the data, go to the operations people and say, where's the opportunity to improve cost of conversion? Where are we leaking profitability? And are we trying to increase volume? Are we trying to increase quality? What are the leading metrics that you would find useful in terms of driving those initiatives and working backwards to which data is relevant to that? So I think that's the three. You nailed it. You don't need me on the show, Paul, because you've nailed the three parts of the flywheel. And I think that's equally what the challenges often are.
Thanks, James. I think it's interesting because it can be easy to just take that data and interpret it and then, like you say, just grab the data and use it. But you're totally right. You've got to then go and rationalize it with the people that are capturing it and understanding it on the shop floor to make sure that it makes sense and, the data is correct and there's not anomalies there and that kind of thing. But it's ironic in a way that smaller businesses, for ages, people would go, I don't need to. And this was like back in the earlier days of Industry 4.0 where people were like, we've only got 10 people in the business. Why do we need to capture all this data when we can walk around the factory and we can see it? And I think now it's becoming more accessible, especially for small businesses, to access all these beautiful tools and information and systems to do this. But it's often the smaller businesses that are like, maybe we don't need it.
Totally. It's really interesting, even in medium to large enterprise, that will go into one client to help them. They're laser focused on really understanding a particular metric. Again, let's say it's a cost, an input cost or equipment utilization or something really specific. And they're convinced, and quite rationally so, that they need to zoom right into that and optimize for that to achieve profitability. And then you go to the next client and they're like, oh, we don't need to look at that little thing over there. It's not really relevant. It's rounding error. And you know what? I think there's a lot of reasons for that. There's a maturity aspect to it. When you haven't gone after the low-hanging fruit, someone's focus area is different than someone else's when the latter person still has some low-hanging fruit to go after. Obviously, scale is an interesting one. Certainly, we have clients where 1% is millions and millions of dollars, and that same 1% for another client is just simply not even worth thinking about, let alone chasing, just because of the elements of scale. And I think there's also an aspect of organizational maturity. We've seen some interesting ones where they are not historical manufacturers, they're startups or people from up and downstream that have gone a vertical integration, and they don't necessarily have the in-house expertise on, say, production planning or routing optimization within a workflow and these sorts of things. So there's a lot of different reasons, but I think it all adds up to the same thing, which is when you're trying to compete on a global scale and there's an increasing need to be more productive, there is more availability of technologies. And when I say that, it's everything from, as I said earlier, ignition, SCADA, machine vision, these things becoming more accessible. I know you guys were at CMAT recently. I was there too. And what really stood out to me was the robotics. Like, to me, a $5 or $10 million organization adopting robotics and some of the automation technologies just wouldn't even have been on my radar. And to go there and see some of these things in the thousands of dollars instead of the hundreds of thousands or millions is astounding. To compete, clearly you've got to be on the front foot and take advantage of those things because your competitors are. And so to a certain extent, if you are on the smaller end of manufacturing, I'd argue that whereas you were always on the back foot vis-a-vis the big guys, because they had that automation, they also didn't have the inherent efficiency that comes from being a small business. So you could offset and go, the guy that's 100 times bigger than me, yes, he's got automation, but he's also got a lot of extra overheads that I don't have. Now the guy up the road that's the same size as you could have a fully automated warehouse, be running, instead of 20 people picking, have 3 or 4. So that's definitely changing the climate and upping the ante for Australian manufacturers. Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's so many advantages to being a small manufacturer now. In Australia, we do such small runs, niche manufacturing, and it's not just the automation, robotics advantages. There's the flexibility and nimbleness, ability to move quickly, make decisions quickly. But also on the digital front, the whole cloud computing from many years ago, that changed the game again, that made software and ERPs and all these other systems accessible to the smaller guys as well. So I think there's a whole range of things that we have a bit of a leg up in Aussie manufacturing, being smaller and more flexible.
You were talking earlier about CMAT, and part of CMAT was obviously the Industrial Transformation Australia conference was attached to that. And one of the keynotes we did was one of the guests made the comment prior to the event, or just before us going on stage, and I parroted it back to him, which was, he said that his view is it's no longer going to be the large organisations eating the small. It's going to be the nimble and the fast eating the slow in terms of the progression of manufacturing moving forward. And I think that's really interesting because the technologies are becoming more accessible to smaller businesses, therefore eroding the competitive advantage that the big boys had in terms of being able to invest in this stuff. The almost competitive advantage flips in some respects, which is now the smaller, more nimble business has access to the same technologies and therefore is also more nimble and can probably move faster. I think that's really interesting, but I still feel like if we get peeled back to one of the things you said earlier around where is the data and how do we get access to it and whatnot, I think the larger organizations have got people who have skills that can look into this stuff and spend the time to write ignition and pull the data out and figure it out. And the small guys are going, oh, I need to bring in partners for that because we don't have those skills in-house. So there's still that little bit of a gap. But having said that, it almost feels like now even the technologies for like this old piece of equipment that I want to sweat the asset for the next 20 years and I don't want to reinvest in a new one just because it has data. It's not. We're now at the point where buying the sensors and whatnot to retrofit these things to get the data out is also now achievable. I think just an interesting landscape in terms of what does the challenge look like? I think it goes from not being able to afford it and it's out of reach to now, where do I start? What do I do? And to your earlier point, if I had the data, what business decision am I going to make with it? And leading with what problem am I trying to solve and going back to what data do I need to solve it?
As I'm listening to you, it's like the old spy versus spy cartoons. I don't know who's going to win. I don't know who to cheer for. And you know what? I totally think you're right. The scale dynamics for the small, being able to go after the big, being able to go after the small. I love that concept of if you're standing still, you're falling behind. All of those scale things can be true under the circumstances. But what's definitely true, regardless of your size, is the need to stay up to date. The ability to stand back and let others take the first step and see what works and what doesn't, I think is one of the big step changes that we've seen in the last year or two. It's just moving so much faster that honestly, probably 2 years ago, a lot of the time I would have said, just let's see where this plays out. Watch your competitors take up these expensive machine vision technologies, see where they're really useful and let the costs come and then take advantage of them. I think now you're just at risk of missing the boat. Predictive maintenance is, again, a really good example, I think, in terms of where a less digital savvy manufacturer can get their hands dirty within a week. We do a lot of work with Movis out of Brisbane in the predictive maintenance space. This is a hardware as a service product that if you're running motors or compressors that are either material to your operational uptime or are just expensive pieces of kit, even needing to overhaul them in a week and $90 per sensor per month as a baseline, and of course it goes down with scale, you can have a sensor that's going to tell you if that thing is going to prevent your factory from operating. It's going to tell you whether there's a business case to sweat that asset a little bit longer, and it can save you from having that unplanned downtime. So these are things that, again, vibration analysis is not a new concept, but it's now accessible to anyone with zero technical skill and a really small budget and can be up and running in no time flat. So it's an exciting time. It's also a time where you've got to be on the front foot. Absolutely.
Thanks for that unscheduled plug there, mate. We had Brad from Movis on the show in season 1 actually, and it's an interesting story, like the whole preventative maintenance and the intelligence behind it, adding so much value, especially in those industries that are critical. You can't shut this machine down for more than 10 minutes. It can be millions of bucks worth of losses. Good one for our listeners to check that out in season 1. I wanted to talk a bit more about, I guess, make it a bit more real, James. What does good look like in this space in terms of people we know using that data, leveraging it, and getting some real insights out of it? Could you give us some sort of practical examples where you've seen this work really well?
Absolutely. I won't name names, even though they're good stories, but happy to share some insights. I think, I really wanted to just highlight when you talk about what good looks like, for me, the first answer is the teams working together. So what good looks like for me, The first thing that comes to mind, if I look at clients that have been working for a long time and they do have a really good example of what good looks like in this space, it's the collaboration between the digital department, the automation or engineering teams that are responsible for those instrumentation components, and the relevant, we'll say, business customers. So whether that's maintenance and engineering from a predictive maintenance standpoint, or whether it's production, whether it's logistics, often sales, right? Some of the times it can be a case of sales having an earlier view on what product they're going to need to move. Planning is a huge thing as well. So I would say what good looks like, number one, is cohesion and collaboration, the right people being responsible and accountable for the right decisions. I know it's not a specific case study, but that is an attribute that I would be looking for in terms of what good looks like. If I think of a real world example, again, without naming names, we had a client in the cotton industry that wanted to introduce automated labeling of bales. And that's a job that historically there's a person attaching those labels to each bale as they come off the line. I think there's a sort of lineage advantage to automation. There's a advantage in terms of the labor of attaching those things. But interestingly, one of the most important things in this concept of automated label application is actually having consistency in how they're applied. So in terms of where they are on the bale, because if you think, say, a more traditional manufacturing plant, having those barcodes consistently show up at the same place on the product is going to mean your automation is much more effective. You have many less circumstances where there was an ineffective read because the barcode was out of place. So this particular client had engaged a firm to do a pilot of, I guess it's the hardware side of it. So the initial thinking was from the production side. So IT got told, we've bought one of these automatic labelers. It's going to be used next season on a bit of a pilot basis. They might be in touch to get access to the network or something. And indeed, that was prior to our involvement, exactly what it was. And I think this is a really typical scenario. Take the specific industry and product and use case aside, this dynamic of IT being told, hey, there's some guys coming to plug some stuff in the network. They might need some help with some blue cable stuff, and we told them you'd help. Zero consideration of what it means for inventory and what could be. Again, I think the biggest point here is they were never in danger of their understanding of the scope and vision being achieved. But think about this. In the pilot, they were using Bartender to do the sequencing, and they literally had a work instruction to open a file in Notepad and put the next bale number in that, hit save, and then Bartender would increment that. Zero connection to the IT, zero connection to the inventory system. If that had been left to scale up, it would have worked, but they would have just missed so much opportunity in terms of being able to create those transactions. So there was this thing where the barcodes would get created by Bartender, and then there would be a barcode scanner afterwards that scans them to create the inventory, which has always been there because, of course, they were normally scanning the human attached ones. Long story short, we were brought in because overall the pilot was seen as proving the potential, but highlighted when they started to look at a lot of the challenges and learnings and feedback from the floor and feedback from customers and concerns like this two different bales having the same number on them. Those sorts of concerns were obviously traced back to the fact that it wasn't tied into the rest of their systems. So they looked at, we want to scale this up, but we need it more seamlessly integrated to the rest of our systems. Otherwise, we're going to have problems rather than solutions. So we worked with their digital team, but also their automation team and their production team and that vendor of the hardware label applicators to put Ignition SCADA in. We used Ignition Edge at the varying facilities and then Ignition in the cloud, Essential Ignition Server in the cloud to do some of the heavy lifting. Really common architecture for us these days, by the way, in a multi-site scenario. By doing that, they got, without going into the proprietary sort of results, I'll just say that they got huge wins on a number of fronts. Again, I think the key point is when they were deploying that pilot in silos, operations, doing things without engineering, then when they came to the IT department to solve some of these data challenges, we were actually the ones that said, we need to involve engineering. We need to involve the instros. We can solve some of the problems that you're having, but some of these are actually not problems of you not talking to the database, it's you not talking to the PLCs. We've got the solution, Ignition SCADA, but we need to bring automation into the fold. And that was a really successful case study, and I attribute it 100% not to any of the technology that was deployed, but the fact that digital operations and the instros were able to work so effectively together once we got through that initial getting to know you phase.
I think that's such a perfect example of what can go wrong when you don't have that cohesion, communication, like you mentioned earlier. That's such a big thing. Guys like yourselves that pull all this stuff together, because sometimes it's just hard within businesses. They're not talking to other departments, and maybe it's not a regular thing. So I think in some cases it's good to get a third party, whoever that is, to come in and just navigate that and facilitate it.
I know you're conscious of not giving away any, I guess, corporate IP as part of the response in terms of making it real for people in terms of success, but just maybe a level abstracted. What are some of the things that people are going for in terms of wins that you've been able to achieve? Is it OEE? Is it DIFOT? What's the thing that's materially turning the dial in terms of value that is the definition of success that's not necessarily client specific?
All of those things, right? And the biggest thing I think we can do as integrators to help is when we come in, normally we ignore the thing that they've asked us to do, and we say, what is your big rock challenges? What are the things that your leadership team is being reported on a weekly basis? What are those CEO level escalations? And often it is things these days like DIFOT and OEE. And so, yeah, when we do sort of initial factory floor walk with a new client, that's something that we really like to drill into is, again, don't just have the IT department there to show us the cabinets and the blue cables, have the operations and the leadership people there so that we understand what's keeping them up at night. And maybe we, again, have some contributions as to how digital can help. So I think all of those things. In general terms, planning is certainly one where digital can help bring more accuracy. I would say accuracy, quality, and efficiency are all typically part of the theme, and all things that we've seen can very much be positively improved through the smart use of data analytics tools. So I talked earlier about predictive maintenance. Again, there's a straight line from predictive maintenance to production throughput and OEE costs. If you're planning smarter, buying your raw ingredients smarter, having the right people on the floor when you need them, all of these things, again, straight lines from solving those immediate challenges to bottom line impact.
I wanted to take the conversation next. We've gone to talk through the big picture problem and some of what do the wins look like. I know we've leaned into this a little bit, but I want to be a little bit more specific, which is, have you seen during these engagements that kind of where things go off track? You talked earlier about teams don't talk, or there's data silos, or the people aren't aligned. But I imagine you've seen other things come up in your time in terms of what doesn't necessarily set this up for success, or what stops us achieving value. When you're thinking about integrating systems like PLCs and SCADA and cloud platforms and all the rest of it, what do you see get in the way of achieving the value?
Great question, Shane. What are the anti-patterns? If that's the happy path, if clearly understanding the big rocks of the business and what's keeping the leadership up at night is all you need to do, and make sure that you're starting from that and working backwards to how technology might be able to help, is the pathway to success. Is everyone successful, or is there are a lot of people falling off that path? And I would say probably the latter. And again, having done this for 20 plus years, and whether it's manufacturing or government or whatever the industry is, it's the same thing. Number one, obviously, if we don't start with the business outcome that we're chasing in mind, we've got no hope. We were in customer conversation the other day, and one of our consultants used the analogy that if you're in a boat and you're heading south and you're focused on how to make the boat go faster, but you should be going north, all you're doing is getting further away from where you need to end up. So I think first and foremost, not to labor the point, a laser focus on the business outcome to be achieved. If you follow that sort of cookie crumbling, another pattern is not seeing the right way to solve the problem. So sometimes we go into a client and they're telling us, oh, we've got these challenges with understanding where inventory is, or if it's real, if it's phantom inventory. Again, real in a partially digitized or medium maturity digitization scenario where you are generating serialized inventory out of a automated process. We sometimes see this scenario where you've got, at the end of the day, huge amounts of phantom inventory, and no one's quite sure whether there's really a box or pallet or whatever it is sitting there corresponding to that inventory. Making sure that we're A, understanding the problem to solve, B, using the best mechanisms to solve it, the right approaches to solve it. That also extends not just to the practical how, as in should we be validating inventory or preventing the phantom inventory in the first place, or both, but also the technologies. So again, we've seen instances where IT departments have been asked to help facilitate something, and they go in and put a cheap and cheerful IoT sensor right next to an existing PLC on instrument that's 5 times the price and 5 times the accuracy. Finally, there's I would say the final piece is actually deriving the value and the benefits in the end. So a common anti-pattern would be, after clearly understanding the business outcome, we finally landed on a very clear, objective, empirical way of saying, here's your problem. And then they go, oh, yeah, that is actually exactly what we thought the problem was. We didn't really need to spend all that money for you to tell us that. We want you to fix the problem. You go, that's not a problem I can fix. So yeah, the final piece would be being prepared to undertake the change, whether that be process, whether that be an attribute of the product. At the end of the day, strangely, we often end up coming to a landing where we tell them what the problem is, how to fix it, in the sense of not necessarily what they need to do to achieve the solution. You know, if you do this, you won't have that problem anymore. And then you come back after 12 months and there's been zero effort to actually try and close the loop. So that's probably some of the anti-patterns. And Shane, I'm sure you've got probably a couple you can add as well from having similar perspectives.
100%. I think oftentimes the ones that I'm seeing is, you talked about data silos and all those sorts of things before. It's that disconnect between what the decision maker thinks they're after as an outcome and then what ends up getting built. And maybe the two aren't necessarily aligned. And sometimes that's, to a point you made earlier, someone running around with a hammer looking for nails to hit. And I've got this solution and I want to sell you this solution. And it's not really what you needed, but it's what I've got. So I'm going to put that in and we'll pretend that it solves the problem, and there's any number of iterations of that. But in the interest of time, I'd love to talk a little bit about what could people do, right? There's often a perception of this feels too hard, it's a big project, it's a big investment, I don't know where to start. And I always like to end the episodes on like practical advice for the listener. You've been sitting here, we've been talking to James, and he's convinced me that I should be doing something. What do I do first?
I think if you play back these themes, it's very clear. Get your team together, get your digital leaders, your production leaders, and your automation leaders, logistics leaders, dare I say the finance team, get them in a room, and to use an AWS sort of concept, work backwards. Don't talk about technology. Talk what's the feedback from your customers. There's quality issues. Your pricing is becoming increasingly challenging to be competitive. What are the issues? Take a step back. Look, do some navel gazing, figure out what are some of the things contributing to that. What are you doing? What are you not doing? Then once you understand which nails to be hit, start talking about what hammers or what tools might be required. And then I think a really important thing is bringing in the right external expertise. Look, there's some people you can follow on podcasts. There's some great websites and people you can follow on LinkedIn. There's a lot of good material, good stuff you can see on YouTube on how to do this stuff. Again, I mentioned one predictive maintenance vendor earlier. We could try and give people sort of the instruction on how to solve individual problems. But I think one common theme is every time we go into a new client that's in the same industry and you assume a carbon copy of some of your other clients, they have a completely different context. And I was saying to someone yesterday that in the same day, I will tell one client, this is the right ERP system for you. You should use this ERP system. And then the next client in the similar industry, you should definitely not use that ERP system. And that's not because I'm difficult or indecisive. It's quite genuine that every organization is different and what's right for one isn't necessarily right for the next. So I think, and when I say get that external perspective, obviously, I think if you can engage a Clevvi or you can engage Shane to come in, we have the advantage of seeing a lot of organizations similar to yours at different levels of maturity with different parts of like different stages of business, but we probably can help you short circuit some of that thinking. And certainly from a Clevvi perspective, I don't know about you, Shane, but from a Clevvi perspective, we'll often come in and do a factory walk as an initial get to know you activity and a proof of value activity. So by all means, I think reach out to those contacts. Equally, if you've got an existing relationship with, say, if you are an induction automation ignition SCADA user, ring the guys at Inductive and have a bit of a chat, because they might say, look, there's a wider integrator ecosystem there that can be leveraged. If you use a cloud provider like AWS, we do a lot of work. It's on my shirt. We do a lot of work on every hyperscaler, but in particular AWS. We recently ran for the third year in a row a manufacturing full day workshop, a roadshow in Sydney, Brisbane, and Melbourne, and they get subject matter experts in to talk about these things. So there's a lot of full paid engagements from people like Clevvi or Shane to having an initial conversation with us just to get to know each other, all the way through to the likes of your existing supplier relationships in AWS or Ignition. Have those conversations. Of course, if you are having them with vendors, be mindful, to your earlier point, Shane, of making sure that you're not being sold a hammer to solve the problem when a hammer isn't the most appropriate tool. But I guess my point is, I think it's fair to say external perspectives is almost essential if you don't have these mindsets and experiences baked into your organization.
We're talking about all these great tools like Ignition, AWS, Snowflake, tools that seem to make things so much easier for people to get their data and get their insights out of it and pull it all together. But given that you've sort of been in the game for a couple of decades, what did that look like 10 years ago? How were you able to pull this sort of stuff together? Obviously, the technology was trickier to use and harder to implement and integrate, but what did that look like 10 years ago?
It's an interesting question. In about 2005, so let's say 20 years ago, I think we were building web-based DIFOT reports that customers could log into for Orford Refrigeration. And I'll name and shame them since they are unfortunately not a Australian manufacturing success story. I mean, we were doing that 20 years ago. They had a MFG Pro ERP system running on Progress, running on some really old Linux distro, and had the old graybeards maintaining that. And again, we talked to the graybeards and we figured out how to get an ODBC driver on that thing, and we wrote some really dodgy PHP code to get some of that information into a web-based application. And initially, it wasn't actually the customers that were seeing that DIFOT stuff, it was their field sellers. So they, at that time, it was again the days of send salespeople on the road to go and call in to see all your customers. And the ask on us was, there's a lot of time spent with the salespeople on the phone to the admin team, understanding before they go and see a customer what sort of the DIFOT's looking for. So if there was a way to, I don't know, having salespeople could automatically get faxed a copy of the DIFOT report to their hotel or something before. It's like, how about we make a little web page that they go, oh, that's amazing. How can you get information out of the Unix system into the web? It's possible. Look, and so fundamentally what we were doing then and what we are doing now hasn't changed. The tools, to your point, are different from a cost to reliability. Obviously, cyber is something that when we look at what we did 20 years ago, you cringe. So necessarily, they're more reliable, they're more secure, they're more maintainable. There's a lot of things that we used to have to write code for. If I rewind maybe a decade, we were making our own circuit boards to do IoT projects that were very simple, fundamentally getting a temperature and sending it over a 3G modem into the cloud. We were having to procure modem chips and do our own designs and get those PCBs made in China. So I think a lot of things have become easier, but we still exist because with the fact that I don't need to invent my own circuit boards now, I now have the opportunity to really dive into the corresponding IoT services and some of the things that we can do and the challenges of being able to do over-the-air firmware updates rather than just taking a set and forget approach to firmware. So definitely the fundamental things that we're doing have really not changed in 2 decades. Some things have become easier, which in turn have brought their own challenges. But what's most exciting to me, and the reason that I still love coming to work every day, is what we can do after we've done the basics. Back then, we were bringing a DIFOT report to a web page. Now we're using AI to plan better, to actually improve DIFOT and be ahead of the game. Fundamentally, in a lot of ways, we're just doing what we did 20 years ago, but we can skip over the boring wiring things together and instead be doing really exciting stuff that moves the needle. I don't think that us exposing a web page to initially a seller and then to the customer directly, even if there's some efficiencies there, I don't know that dramatically had a material impact on the bottom line. I do think that when we can reduce defects by an order of magnitude and reduce inventory holdings by an order of magnitude, that does move the needle. So that's probably the most exciting thing now.
James, you're talking to an ex-electronics guy here, so you're not allowed to say things like boring hardware on the show. But anyway, fair to say, as business challenges change, technology will adapt. And at the end of the day, we're still just solving business problems using different technology. It's been great to have you on the show, mate. And I'm sure we'll catch up again soon.
Thanks for having me. It's been a great chat. Thanks so much.
Thanks for tuning in to Manufacturing Tech Australia with Shane and Paul, recorded on the traditional lands of the Bunurong and Wurundjeri people. For more information, jump on the manufacturingtech.au website. Remember to hit the follow button to join us again next time as we continue to explore the intersection of manufacturing and technology.